All right, ready to dive into this one. People Leaving Science, it's been making headlines, and you guys sent us a fascinating mix of sources to unpack.
Always interesting to see what grabs people's attention. And this time, we've got, let me see, a brand new research paper. Very official.
Right, gotta love those fresh insights.
Absolutely.
Uh,
But to balance that out, we're also digging into, wait for it, a Reddit thread.
The best kind of deep dive is the one with multiple perspectives. So we've got those comments from actual researchers, boots on the ground, or should I say goggles in the lab.
There you go. Gotta love a good visual. But yeah, it's that classic combo data, paints the broad strokes, but those personal experiences.
That's where the why behind the numbers starts to come alive.
Exactly. So where do we even begin? I guess the big question we're trying to answer with this deep dive is it really as simple as women are more likely to leave science? Because that's what we hear a lot, right?
That's the headline, right? But I have a feeling there's more to the story.
Oh, there's always more to the story. But we've got to start somewhere. So let's start with that familiar narrative, the one about those leaky pipelines and chilly climates. All those systemic barriers women in STEM fields are up against.
Right, like that pressure to work crazy hours, dealing with colleagues who just don't get it, hitting that motherhood penalty just when you're hitting your stride. It's enough to make anyone want to say, peace out, I'm out of here.
Exactly. And when you look at that Reddit thread, it's clear those barriers are far from ancient history. One researcher described their lab as a pressure cooker, where you're expected to be like top tier right out of the gate.
Wow, top 5% right off the bat. Those were their exact words.
Intense, right. And another researcher said something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, modern science is less about discovery and more about grant applications, publishing papers that are only slightly different from everyone else's, and then watching your advisor take credit for your best work. I mean,
It's a lot, and it kind of highlights this point that gets lost sometimes in these conversations. Those workplace challenges, they don't discriminate. They can make anyone want to throw in the towel, regardless of gender.
100%. And speaking of challenges that don't discriminate, can we talk about the one thing that unites pretty much every field ever?
Oh, you're going there.
Gotta be real, right?
Hit me with it.
Money.
Ah, yes. The root of all. Well, a lot of things.
I mean, Predict Babe on Reddit said it best. People tend to be quite fond of having food to eat. Most often, research is extremely poorly paid.
Hard to argue with that logic. It's not just about feeling supported or battling biases. It's the economic reality of trying to build a career, a life, on a foundation that's, well, often not that financially solid, especially when we're talking about careers that require a doctorate.
Right, the opportunity cost alone is enormous.
Yeah.
But okay, before we get too deep into the financial weeds, let's bring in that research paper you mentioned, because they went deep on attrition rates using this huge dataset publication records from Scopus. Thousands of scientists spanning 38 OECD countries.
Okay, for those of us who don't have that memorized, OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Right, so mostly higher income countries, just for context, which means their findings are particularly relevant for researchers working in, say, the U.S.
Got it. Makes sense. So what did they find? Anything groundbreaking?
Well, they didn't just look at attrition overall. They got specific, divided those scientists into two groups, what we call cohorts. One group started publishing around the year 2000, the other around 2010.
Interesting. So two different snapshots in time, basically.
Exactly. To see if these patterns we think we know, especially about women leaving science, do they hold true across different generations of scientists? Because a lot can change in 10 years, right?
That's what we're here to find out.
So get this, for the 2000 cohort, that leaky pipeline thing totally tracks. Women were way more likely to just, poof, disappear from the publication record as time went on, compared to their male colleagues, obviously.
Okay, so far, not surprising, sadly. But the 2010 group, that's where it gets juicy, right?
Hold on to your hats, because with the 2010 cohort, that difference practically vanishes.
Vanishes, like gone, gone. Wait, hold on. We're talking about a massive shift in just 10 years. What could even explain that kind of change so fast?
Million-dollar question right there.
Oh.
And full disclosure, this research paper, it doesn't exactly give us a neat and tidy answer.
Science rarely does it?
Truth. But it does throw out some fascinating possibilities. So one idea, maybe, just maybe, those efforts to address the leaky pipeline, all those diversity initiatives, mentorship programs, you know the drill.
Right, trying to make science a bit less of a boys' club.
Exactly. So maybe those efforts actually started to make a dent for that 2010 group. It's possible, right?
Cautious optimism. I like it. But before we start celebrating, there's always another side to the coin. Or another possibility, I guess. What about those pull factors? The stuff outside academia that might be tempting someone to jump ship.
Oh, you're talking about things like, I don't know, decent salaries.
Maybe even a living wage, the audacity. But seriously, what if those factors, those alternatives, got even more appealing between 2000 and 2010?
Hitting the nail on the head. Because remember those Reddit comments about struggling to make ends meet? If the job market outside of science turned into this, like, siren song of financial stability?
Makes sense that both men and women would be tempted. Even if, let's say, those barriers within academia were easing up for women.
It's that classic dilemma, passion versus practicality. Or, to put it in even simpler terms, follow the money. Which, by the way, isn't always a bad thing, right? People have bills to pay.
No judgment here. But okay, before we completely derail into a whole economic debate, you mentioned something about this research getting even wilder, something about specific fields.
Oh yeah, we're just getting to the good part. Because, reminder for everyone listening, science isn't some big monolith, right? It's a zillion different fields, each with its own quirks, its own challenges.
And its own version of that chilly climate we talked about. I'm sensing some juicy subplots here.
Oh, there are always subplots. So are you ready for this? The fields you'd think would be the toughest for women, the ones notorious for being, like, cutthroat competitive and, well, yeah, male-dominated.
You're talking about those hardcore STEM fields, right?
Yeah.
Engineering, computer science, physics, that whole world.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. Those are the ones. But here's the kicker. In those specific fields, men and women, they're leaving at practically the same rate across both cohorts.
Wait, so the gender gap that's shrinking overall in those specific fields, it just disappears.
It's gone. Which, yeah, throws a wrench into some of those assumptions we make about why women leave science. Because if it were just about hitting more roadblocks or feeling less supported, wouldn't we see those gaps explode in the fields that are supposedly the most brutal?
Makes you think, right? Like, is there something about those fields themselves, maybe about the kind of people who gravitate toward them that could explain this? Remember that whole pressure cooker comment? Needing to be top 5% right from the get-go?
Oh, totally. It's like, in those high stakes, gotta be brilliant fields, the people who not only survive but thrive, men or women, they're already wired differently. Super driven, crazy talented, resilient as hell. They've already jumped through hoops just to get to the starting line.
So those other challenges, child's play in comparison.
Basically. It's almost like the field itself weeds out anyone who isn't 100% in. From day one, gender is almost irrelevant at that point.
A self-selection process, but with like way more caffeine and late nights.
And probably fewer social lives. But it does make you think about this whole idea of how we define success in science and how we measure who stays and who doesn't. Because we tend to put so much emphasis on publishing in those big-name journals, racking up grants, climbing that academic ladder.
It's publish or perish world, which, by the way, sounds absolutely terrifying if you're not familiar with academia.
Right. It's brutal. And while those achievements, they're important, no doubt, it does create this very specific, maybe even narrow view of what it means to actually contribute to science.
Because for every researcher who ditches the ivory tower, there might be another one finding a way to make a difference somewhere else.
Right.
Like different path, same goal.
100%. Think about those alternative paths: industry, science communication, government, policy, all those places where a scientific mind is invaluable, even if you're not cranking out papers like it's going out of style.
And those paths might not come with the same bragging rights, the academic prestige, but
they can be incredibly rewarding, both personally and professionally. And let's be real, sometimes they pay a heck of a lot better, which, as we've established, is not irrelevant.
So, okay, where does this all leave us? We've got this research suggesting the gender gap in science, at least when it comes to who's leaving. Maybe it's not as clear-cut as we thought. But at the same time, more scientists overall seem to be saying see ya to the whole thing, men and women, plus those field-specific findings, whole other can of worms.
It's a lot, right? But I think it boils down to this question: why are brilliant people, people who clearly dedicated years of their lives to science, why are they walking away? And it's more complicated than just saying, oh, they lost their passion, or assuming everyone who starts out in research is dreaming of tenure in a corner office.
Right. Right, because if the choice is between chasing a research career that barely covers the rent and taking a job that, like, triples your salary, even if you love the research, well, something's got to give.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where those Reddit comments, they really hit home for me. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, the big data sets, but those are real people with real lives, families to feed.
Predict Babe's words, not mine. people tend to be quite fond of having food to eat. Might sound funny, but it's deep, you know? If we're serious about keeping those amazing minds engaged in science, those discoveries, they need to lead to careers that can actually sustain a life.
100%. And that brings up another point, this whole idea of using publication records as the ultimate measure of staying in science. It makes sense on the surface, right? Publishing, it's how you share your findings, build your rep, climb the ladder.
It's the currency of the academic realm. But it does create this, like, very specific, almost rigid definition of what it means to be a scientist. It's like if we only judged a musician's success by how many albums they sold and totally ignored their live shows, their collaborations.
Love that analogy. Because there are so many ways to contribute to science that go beyond just those journal articles. Mentoring students, collaborating with other researchers, translating those lab breakthroughs into real-world solutions.
Don't forget teaching. Inspiring the next generation of science nerds, that's got to count for something.
Absolutely. But those contributions, as important as they are, they don't always show up on a CV, you know? So yeah, this research paper, it gives us a lot to chew on, but it's only one slice of a much bigger picture.
A snapshot, focusing on one particular angle. It doesn't erase those very real hurdles that women, people of color, they still face in STEM. But it does suggest that maybe, just maybe, the tide is turning a little bit.
And that's worth acknowledging. But I think the biggest takeaway, for me at least, is that if we want a scientific landscape that's truly thriving, we got to expand our definition of success.
Value all the ways scientists contribute, create career paths that are more diverse, more sustainable, and for goodness sake, make sure those folks who are dedicating their lives to pushing the boundaries of knowledge, make sure they can afford to, like, live.
Preach. Okay, so on that note, dear listeners, as you go about your week, here's something to ponder. What is? Instead of asking why people leave science, we started asking how we can make science a place where people want to stay.
Now there's a question worth thinking about. And on that note, we'll leave you to do just that. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.